The Million Student March for Debt Reduction. This Mary Greenswig and Stephen Swig writing at the Huffington Post. A new wave of activism against student debt is on the move again this week. And they're pointing out that $1.3 trillion in student debt is a serious drag on our economy. And back in November of last year, this was, 5 months ago, we had hundreds of thousands of young people at demonstrations over 125 campuses, the Million Student March. And this Wednesday, that's tomorrow, the next round of protests will command the attention of Americans immersed in our primaries. The demonstrators have 4 demands. Number 1, tuition-free public college education. Number 2, cancellation of all student debt. It shouldn't have been there in the first place. Number 3, a $15 minimum wage for all campus workers. And number 4, divestment of university endowments from private prison corporations. And there's, I am a student debt voter. You can get these bumper stickers. IamAStudentDebtVoter.org is the website for a T-shirt, union made in the United States. So the question in my mind is, when is this student debt protest going to turn into a student debt strike? And if it does, how, what's going to be involved in creating the kind of crisis that people can't ignore anymore? In other words, if it's a variation on the old joke. If you owe your bank $1,000 and you can't pay it, you have a problem. If you owe your bank $100 million and you can't pay it, your bank has a problem. So there's a certain critical threshold of students who, if they were to stop paying their student loans altogether and just say, that's it, debt strike, there's a certain critical threshold beyond which it would be just like virtually impossible to enforce. I remember the summer of 1968, I was living in San Francisco, and I was living in a building on Fell Street, which is about a block or 2 away from either Haight or Ashbury, and about 3 or 4 blocks from the corner of Haight and Ashbury, which was the epicenter of the planet in the summer of 1968. And the building that we were living in had this, it was a rental building, and it had this giant banner outside. It was painted on a sheet, and it said "Rent Strike," and they were all over the city. Now, I don't, frankly, I was not all that. I was not part of that. I was more, hanging out in People's Park and hanging out in the city and whatnot. I was not one of the ones who put together the rent strike, but my recollection is that there were a bunch of rent strikes going on around the city, and people were not paying their rent, and protesting the rapidly rising rent as the city was becoming like this incredible tourist attraction in the summer of '67, summer of '68, and whether there was a link between the two, I frankly don't know, but. And whether there were enough rent strikes to clog up the courts that it couldn't be enforced, I don't know. But it was certainly my sense at the time that that's what was going on. So the question, I guess, is, how many people would have to refuse to pay their student debt before it became such a crisis that the student loan folks would go to the federal government and say, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, over $1 trillion in student debts that people are not paying their debts on, and we're freaking out, so we would like the government to cover this. Now, keep in mind, the best estimate for what Iraq is going to end up costing us by the time the last of the Iraq war veterans die, because, you've got to pay for caring for them through the VA and all this sort of thing, all through this, not to mention whatever we're going to do in terms of rebuilding the country that we destroyed after George W. Bush and Dick Cheney lied us into an absolutely unnecessary war that has produced all this chaos across the Middle East. But that the price tag for that thing is over $6 trillion. So far, we've spent over $1.6 trillion. So we've got $1.3 trillion in student debt. If George Bush hadn't invaded Iraq, we could just pay off all the student debt. And that's with money that we've already spent. 1.3 trillion sounds like a hell of a lot of money. It's less than we're spending in Afghanistan. It's less than we're spending in Iraq. So why don't we just declare a jubilee, a debt holiday, and just say, okay, that's it. It's a jubilee. And that, now the one good argument against that I've heard is from people who say, I had a student loan. I had a $30,000 student loan, and I worked for 10 years, and I paid it off. What about me? And I'm wondering if we should just kind of look back at the last 30 years. I mean, there pretty much wasn't student debt when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980 or 1981 when he was sworn in. Student debt was a very rare thing. Student debt was pretty much limited to law school, medical school, dental school. The real expensive, really long classes where, it's really hard to get into these schools, and it's pretty much graduate degrees. So what if we were to say anybody who had and paid off student debt between 1981 and today that was not graduate school, we're going to actually reimburse you. It might come to another $1 trillion, but it's money we should have been spending all along. We should have been investing in our young people. And that would be a huge stimulus to the economy if all these people who had, the student debt before, if you get a check for 30 grand, you think? I mean, this is not something that's impossible for us to do. I realize I'm suggesting something that goes way beyond anything any of the presidential candidates are suggesting, or frankly, I don't know any politician who is saying this. But I'm saying it, and I think that we need to have a national conversation about it. And the conversation probably will not happen until a critical mass of students start refusing to pay their student debt. Now, whether that's 5% or 15% or 30% or 80%, I don't know. What is the tipping point? What is the critical amount? What percentage of students not paying back their student loans, or post-students, what percentage of people not paying back their student loans is it going to take to so weaken the system that bankruptcy bill that Joe Biden pushed through the Senate back in 2005, that Joe Biden's bankruptcy bill that made it illegal for students to declare bankruptcy on their student debt, that gets repealed. And that they say, okay, at least with a bankruptcy procedure, the banks can write down the debt. They can take it as a deduction off their taxes, just like, Goldman Sachs now. They paid $5 billion to the Treasury Department so that none of their executives go to prison. They get to write at least half of that off their taxes. Plus, the government's going to actually give them back millions of dollars in tax credits. It's like, Anyhow, I digress. So what if we could put together some sort of a student debt? I'm not the guy to lead this movement, but and it should be organic and from the grassroots. But what are your thoughts on how many students it's going to take refusing to pay their debt? And how long is it going to be before this revolt happens? I got a note from Gaius Publius the other day. He's been writing about this over at Down with Tyranny, blogspot, downwithtyranny.blogspot.com. I'm not sure if it's his website or he just posts there a lot. What is the tipping point? Where are these thresholds? Does the democracy spring lead to this? See, I'm looking at a revolution in this country that has started that started a decade ago and is still rolling along and picking up steam.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So where does this go? And if you have a lot of student debt, what are your thoughts on that? Or if you don't have any, what are your thoughts on it? So Deborah just called and said, hey, wait a minute. I had to co-sign my son's $40,000 in student loans. And I'm not a person of means. I can't afford that. If they come after me, then I get wiped out. And Deborah's absolutely right. That's the other big scam that the banksters are doing now. And one of the reasons why they're actually making derivatives now out of student debt. This is the bizarre thing. They are creating this whole empire of derivatives. And in fact, we have 3 kids. We said that we would, thank God we had the ability to do it. We had done well in business in the 80s and 90s, that we would pay for their first 4 years of college, but after that, you're on your own. And all of them went on to graduate school, and all of them now have student debt. And I had to co-sign one of those. And for a PhD for a fairly substantial amount of money. And I get the notices every month. So if in this case, it's one of my daughters, if my daughter was to say, okay, I'm going on debt strike, I'm going to refuse to pay this, guess who gets stuck with the bill? Dad, or dad and mom. And if dad and mom refuse to pay it, well, I don't know how, a lot of people can do that. So maybe it's not even, I just don't know how widespread this practice is of requiring the parents to secure that all student debt must be secured, but I'm guessing that it is growing. I know a number of the student loans that 2 of my kids took out, they just were able to take out based on a signature. And I think it was in part because it's not dischargeable, but probably not entirely, actually, because a lot of it was before 2005, before Joe Biden's bankruptcy bill. But I just that's a significant fly in the ointment to the student debt strike, is the parents or others, friends, relatives. It's all secured loans and nothing else.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.